How's everyone doing? Good. Long day, a lot of talks, a lot of really inspiring stuff. So my talk is called Sweating the Small Stuff, Recreating Subtle Design Details Using SASS. And I'm surprised I actually don't have the longest name in this conference. Jackie's talk is longer than mine. I worried that I was going to break the layout of the website with this, but I didn't. And so Berman's talk was about bridging the designer-developer gap, and my talk is also kind of like that. But so this actually works out pretty well. I was like totally nervous that he was going to step on my toes and like talk about all the stuff I was going to talk about. But he kind of brought more of like a theory, like almost a designer perspective to it. But like I'm going to dive deep into the code and talk about some like real practical stuff that you can use to actually take what's in Photoshop and make it CSS. And I'll only apologize once. My voice is kind of gone, so it's a little raspy, but let's go. My slides are up on GitHub. If you're having trouble seeing the code, there is a lot of code, so if you want to check it out, the slides are there. Left and right, move the slides. And it only works in Chrome because I just made it for myself. So yeah, anyway. So my name's Tim Hettler. I'm an open standards developer at RGA here in New York City. We're a digital agency. And I'm going to talk about this button for the next 40 minutes. And there's a lot going on here, so don't worry. There's 40 minutes of stuff to talk about. And the story, it's about the story of this button and how it goes from Photoshop and into CSS without missing any of the many details that are in this button. So we were working on a major redesign for an e-commerce site, one of our clients. And so our designers created this button in Photoshop. And so not just this button with this color, but like 20 different variations. It's an e-commerce site. There's seasonal colors. There's all different portions of the site that all need to like be branded separately. And so the developers looked at this button, and it looks pretty straightforward, almost kind of fun to do because there's a lot of CSS3 stuff in it. You can see there's gradients, there's text shadows, rounded corners, box shadows, all that good stuff. So looks like a pretty straightforward transfer, right? Well, this is what our developers returned with after the first round. Obviously, something is wrong here. And so we started talking with our developers and designers, and we're like, so what happened, guys? Like, why does this look like shit? And so we started talking, and the designers, they're describing their button, and they're saying, well, the drop shadow has a 90-degree angle with a distance of 1 pixel. And the developers are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I need an X and a Y offset. And then the designers are talking about blend. They're like, well, the button looks wrong because you're not using like blend modes properly. And the developers just have no idea what that even means. They've never heard of a blend mode. And so obviously we're having a failure to communicate. There's a translation problem. Designers and developers they don't speak the same language. What designers, the numbers and the things that designers work in Photoshop just aren't the same as the things that developers need. And so, how do you solve this problem? How do you make this translation happen? So this is the traditional process, and you're not supposed to be able to read this. It's supposed to be like comically complex. So this is our first round of buttons. And so what we ended up doing is the designer went in with their eyedropper tool and found the hex code of every button, the top gradient and the bottom gradient for the normal state, and then the top gradient and the bottom gradient for the active state. And then we also had to divide it up because some buttons got white text and some buttons got black text depending on the background color. And so there's so many failure points in this traditional translation process. The designer can make mistakes inputting and creating the style guide, and then every single developer that gets handed this, and it's a very large company, there's dozens of developers, there's in-house developers, there's different agencies working for them. So there's just so many opportunities for somebody to mess up this translation process. And so what do we do? So with SASS, we can automate this translation. SASS can be our Rosetta Stone between what designers create in Photoshop and what developers need in CSS. So let's rebuild this button using SASS this time instead of doing a terrible job with CSS. So first, before we get into the fun Photoshop the CSS translations, first we need to do some code abstraction here. This is a prototype selector, or a placeholder selector for our button. And so this is all just the garbage that you need to put into every button to sort of undo what browsers naturally do to a button, and anything that our button is going to need no matter what color it is. This is all just this setting the font size, resetting the margins, making sure the text decoration doesn't, if it's a link instead of a button, making sure it doesn't get underlined by accident. So if you're a JavaScript guy, you can kind of think about this as like the prototype for our button, and so every button is an extension of this prototype. And so we can use the placeholder selector. And so what this does is allows us to write our code so that each button, our orange button, our blue button in this case, all the code that needs to create this button is encapsulated in one style. And so you can see, so we extend the placeholder button. So like when you're writing it as a developer, everything that you need for that button is one place. But then when it gets compiled to CSS, instead of with mixins, it copies all of your selector properties into each class. But with placeholders, kind of do the inverse of that, where they extend the chain of selectors. So you can see in our CSS, instead of copying all that junk into each individual class, it just extends our class selector. And so this is kind of a simple thing, and placeholders are like a pretty basic part of SASS, but it's a really powerful idea, because what it allows us to do is we can create modular sort of object-oriented code for developers to read and to write, but we don't have to sacrifice that speed and efficiency in production. So when SASS compiles it, it'll automatically do what's best for efficiency and for a low file size. So we kind of get the best of both worlds when we use placeholders. So now we kind of have our basic button. This is our boilerplate, and so all we're really doing now is defining the background color. And I mentioned we're going to start talking about how we can abstract the design logic. So the designer is saying, well, dark buttons need to have light text, and light buttons need to have dark text so you can actually read it, which makes sense. And so right now we just have like a big list of like these are the dark colors and these are the light colors. But Compass actually comes with a function that determines the lightness of a color. And so this is just from the Compass source code. It's a color contrast function. It converts the color to the HSL color space and looks at the lightness, the L part, and says, well, if the lightness is above or below a certain threshold, then it's light or dark. And you give it two colors, and you say, okay, if it's dark, return this color. If it's light, return that color. And so that's cool. That's exactly what we need. And so we put that in, and so our appropriate text color gets set automatically. You can see there's a mixin that sets the background color and the text color. You can see on the left, we use the mixin, and then on the right, our CSS. It just outputs exactly what we need. So we did that with our buttons, and so we show this to our designers, and these goddamn picky designers are like, well, it's cool, but they're like, well, the green looks okay, but really, like the blue and the red, they should really have white text. I'm like, I don't know what you're they're like, it just looks kind of weird. It doesn't look like the contrast is right. So the default contrast settings with Compass is 30%. So lightness needs to be below 30% for it to be considered a dark color. So I'm like, all right, I'll just bump that up a little bit. And so we up the lightness threshold to 50%. And so these are the HSL values. And you can see, and now they're like, whoa, what happened? So blue is right now, but now green is wrong, and red still didn't change. And I'm like, but the numbers, it's a dark color. And they're like, it just doesn't look right, man. So I start looking into this, and I start trying to figure out, and like we were doing some crazy stuff where it's like, okay, if the hue is between like 36 and 120, and then the lightness is over 60, then it's this color. And so we were just going nuts with it. Really wasn't very helpful at all. But so I started doing more research. And so it turns out that our eye is more sensitive to changes in the orange-blue range than the purple-green range. And I do need to stop, and I've always wanted to do this with CSS, with the text mask, with the background color. I'm really glad that I finally got to do it. That's great. So I'm very excited. Thank you, yes. So doing more research, and I find that there's a color space, like there's RGB and HSL are different color spaces, and I'm not going to pretend like I know a ton about color space. I know enough so that I can do this talk. So the YIQ color space, it was actually defined for television broadcasts. And it sort of it took advantage of the fact that like our eye isn't as sensitive to certain colors to save bandwidth. And so what I did is I've created a new function that basically just piggybacks off, it works just like the color contrast function, color contrast mixin in Compass. It has the same attributes and returns the same stuff. But instead of just looking at the lightness, it weights the different colors differently. So red, green, and blue, they're all weighted separately, and so they have different effects on the overall lightness or darkness of the color. And so so this one is, so it returns a value between 0 and 255. And so now you can say if the YIQ value is above or below 128, then it's dark or light. And so this is released. This is a Compass extension that you can check out on GitHub. It's also Bourbon compatible, but there's no way to ship Bourbon code like encapsulated. So it's a Compass extension, but it doesn't actually use Compass. So now we have our YIQ color contrast, and these are the values. So you can see that even though their lightness in the HSL space was very similar, they actually have pretty different values when you convert it to YIQ. And so now our designers are like, sweet, you did it. This looks good now. And so this is a cool opportunity here too. A lot of my talk is about like how do you take what designers are doing and like figure out how to make it work in code. But this is one of these instances where I was listening to a designer and like their gut feeling, like they have great sense of aesthetic and great sense of taste. So like they could feel when something was wrong, but didn't understand that there was like a biological reason really. And so that there was an algorithm we could use to take advantage of their gut feeling. And so this is another opportunity and something great that SASS can do. It can take a designer's gut feeling and take it and turn it into a repeatable pattern, which is another very powerful thing with SASS, because now we don't have to guess, and say we don't have to throw every color to a designer and be like, is this light or dark? We now have a system. So now we're going to talk about managing state and how. So one of the other kind of pieces of logic that the designers built into these buttons is that when you hover over a dark button, it gets lighter, and a light button gets darker. And so this is actually pretty simple to do in SASS because it's another opportunity that you don't need to go into Photoshop and get out the color dropper tool or the eyedropper tool and figure out the RGB values. If you look, I opened up the Photoshop file that the designers used, and they're using just a layer mask, and they're adjusting the lightness value directly. They're not just layering a color on top of it. They have their own internal system where they've decided they're going to move the lightness down and up 5%. And with CSS, those numbers didn't matter. It always needed to be a hex value. So it didn't even occur to them to explain their system. But when I looked in their Photoshop files, it became clear, what they weren't just making up these numbers, which is good, I guess. They had their own system. Sometimes designers just make up stuff, but they weren't. This is good. So, but we can just utilize the built-in SASS color functions to adjust our color. And so the adjust color function does just that. You can manipulate the hue, saturation, lightness. You can do crazy stuff with adjust color. And it's actually kind of cool because this is one of those functions where I was like, what? This doesn't seem very practical to do because you're not just adjusting colors on the fly. But I finally found a place where it did make sense when you're interacting with a designer system. You can use the same. You don't have to just translate the hex values. You can use the same vocabulary to describe what's happening in Photoshop and what's happening in CSS. And so now we adjust the lightness, and when it comes in CSS, now we have the correct logic. So we've sort of eliminated a lot of the variables and a lot of translation things that can get screwed up. And so now we have a system for building these buttons. And really it's all we're doing is setting a background color, and things are just happening automatically. It's great. So now we're speaking the same language. We're talking about lightness when we don't have to convert between hex values and lightness. We're just saying like the lightness changes, and as a developer now you can be like, okay, I can just do that. So we have our basic button, we have the basic logic now, and so we're going to talk about some of the fancier translation issues, really having to do with layer effects like drop shadow and gradients and stuff like that. So our first thing we're going to talk about is drop shadows, the box shadows. And so this is our box shadow syntax. I'm sure you've all made a box shadow before. So, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. So you have your X and Y offset, and then your blur radius and your spread radius, which affects like how big how big and how fuzzy the box shadow is, and then your color and whether it's inset or not. And so the drop shadow in Photoshop is it's done from a completely different perspective. I mean, you still obviously have color and opacity, and you have spread and size, which are handled actually they're tricky because they look like they're the same as the CSS values, but they're actually not. But what I want to talk about first is the angle and distance and how that turns into an X and Y offset. And so I know we're all very far away from high school at this point, but if you have an angle and you have a distance and you need an X and a Y offset, you're talking about a right triangle. And so you're like you're trying to find missing sides of a triangle. And so to do that, we use SOHCAHTOA. Yeah, right? You can call up your high school math teacher and say, it was useful, you were right. Damn it. So yeah, I mean, so the distance in Photoshop is basically the hypotenuse of our triangle. And so we have the angle and we have the hypotenuse. And so just by using cosine, which is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, we get our opposite, which is our X offset. And then we use sine, which is opposite or over hypotenuse, and that gives us our Y offset. Cool. So yeah, so now we have a Photoshop plugin, and this is this Photoshop plugin was developed by another guy, not me. I got halfway through developing my own, and then I was like, maybe I should search on Google to see if somebody's already done this. And so he did, and so this guy's Hey Grady. He's on GitHub. He actually has a couple. He has a blend mode Photoshop plugin, and he's done some cool Photoshop conversion stuff. So with his permission, I'm showing you guys the code, and so what this does, and basically you put in all the different all the values that are in your Photoshop drop shadow, and it just it does the conversions for you, and then outputs something what CSS needs: your X, your Y offset, your blur, and your CSS spread. And so now we can take exactly what's in the Photoshop file, and we can put it in the SASS using this function, and what gets returned is a valid CSS box shadow. So now this is a live button. So when you click on it, you get an inset shadow, and there's like a little subtle drop shadow on it now. And so this is one of these things where like you can eyeball it, and you can get 90% of the way there, but really, we shouldn't eyeball stuff if we don't have to. And I don't like the idea of eyeballing stuff. I don't like the idea of like having to do like stupid back and forth. And most designers, you go back and forth, and you're like, well, it's a little bad, but I just assume that's the best you can do. Now there's no translation. The translation is automated. We don't have to eyeball it. So it's exactly what it was in Photoshop. And so we can do the same thing for text shadow. We'll go over this quick. It's kind of a freebie because it's all the same math. The only difference is that for some reason CSS text shadows don't support the spread property. So if you want to be a nice developer, you can kind of warn people if they try to use the spread. And so that doesn't, it still lets SASS compile, but it just comes up in the command line that like, hey, you're doing something that's not supported. And so what we do is we take all the values from Photoshop, and then we get that value, and then so instead of returning the whole thing, because if we return the spread value, it would actually our text shadow would be wrong, because it would be using the different values, it would be using the wrong values for each section. So we take nth and we just like break it up, and because what it returns is a space separated list basically, and so we can just take each value in that list. And so we get the X offset, the Y offset, and the size and the color. So now we're going to add it again. We're going to use all these values. And so now we have our drop shadow too. And this on active state, it just flips, 90 or 180 degrees. Yeah, that's how many circles, 360. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting pretty close now. Our button is almost there, but we still have our gradients that we have to deal with. And so we're going to talk about how to convert our gradient overlay into a CSS linear gradient. And so, again, we've all worked with gradients before. And so what it takes is an angle or a keyword, and then a series of color stops, which is a color, and then a percentage or a pixel of like how far down the color stop is. So, and what Photoshop asks for is pretty similar, but we have a opacity, gradient, angle, and scale, and I'm going to do things a little out of order here. Tarantino it up here. We're going to talk about angle first because that's an easy one, but unfortunately, first I don't know why it's like this, but so with Photoshop, 0 degrees equals east, and with CSS, 0 degrees equals north. And it's dark out now, so my screen adjusts so that I don't hurt my eyes. With Photoshop, 0 degrees equals east, but with CSS, it equals north. And I was looking in the docs for CSS, and I don't know why it's different. I mean, I guess it's just arbitrary. I mean, 0 degrees can equal anything. But anyway, so what we need to do to convert the Photoshop to the CSS angle is we just need to subtract 90 degrees from whatever is put in the Photoshop. So scale, your first instinct, and my first instinct was when you see the scale, you're like, oh, I'll just use background size. That'll make it easy. But really, what we'd like to do is we want to just return one value. We want this to be a function instead of a mix-in, so that we can use this function alongside Compass's background image mix-in, so that we can do multiple background images if we want, and we can. I didn't realize this until I started researching for these conversions, but color stops can actually start can be less than 0 or greater than 100. And so what we do is I worked out this algorithm to scale our gradient. And so what we want is the middle is always the middle, but we want it to kind of grow from that middle. And this algorithm is a hyperbolic paraboloid, according to Wolfram Alpha, which I plugged this into, which basically means that just the farther away you get from the center, the more intense the scaling is. And so we have our examples here, and you can see like if the scaling is 100%, what you put in is what you get out. But when you scale it larger, you can see our 0% actually goes before it goes less than 0. So we go from negative 25% to 125%. And then if you get smaller, then vice versa. So this is cool. So we can take the scale and we can change our color stop values so that the scale in our Photoshop gradient is exactly what gets translated into CSS. So this is kind of some gnarly code, but we'll go through it. So what we need to do is to create the CSS syntax. We need to take those lists of color stops that are in Photoshop. We need to start a for loop, and we go through each one. And so we take the color stop of each one, and then we adjust it based on the scale, and then we output a new list that has the correct color stop based on our scale. So basically, we're just breaking apart a list and then making a new list. And so then we take our CSS direction, which if you remember is just the angle subtract 90 degrees, and then that new list of color stops that has been adjusted for our scale. And so this works for simple gradients. This is about as simple as a gradient gets from black to white. Or if your designer happens to be on LSD that day, it can take a complex gradient and then do the same thing. And I won't go through this code. It works, trust me. But so really, whatever gradient you put in, you can get a CSS gradient out of it. And so let's add this to our button now and finish things up. We're going to take the values that were in Photoshop, and we're going to put them into our button, and things are going to look great. Whoa, plot twist. Something looks wrong. So the colors are wrong. The gradient is not correct. So what happened here? Something we've been ignoring the whole talk is blend modes. And so, and as I mentioned, it said in the beginning, I didn't know what a blend mode was until like 8 months ago. A lot of developers don't know what a blend mode. They don't understand what it does. But so a blend mode is they're algorithms for mixing colors. And so a normal blend mode, that is to say no blend mode, you take a background, a foreground, and then you just return that foreground. But there's a couple different types of blend modes. These are kind of two of the more popular ones. The multiply blend mode always returns a darker value. It always darkens the background. It'll take like the darker of the two colors. And then our overlay blend mode is a contrast blend mode. So light colors get lighter and dark colors get darker. And so there's actually there's like a couple dozen different blend modes, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Overlay is the one that is used on this project, and actually it's a very common blend mode. But so there are some limitations with these blend modes. In Photoshop, you can just apply a blend mode to anything. You could apply it to a drop shadow, and it will automatically blend what's behind it. With SASS, since we're compiling in the CSS, we need to know both the foreground and the background color in advance. So for things like drop shadows, it's not very helpful. But with our gradient, which is like on a button, we know what the background color is going to be. This is perfect. So we're going to update our gradient overlay function again. And so this time, when we go through the for loop, in addition to adjusting the scale, we're also going to take the color that's in that color stop, and we're going to like run it through our blend mode function. And here, we're defining we want the overlay blend. And then, it mixes the background and foreground according to that algorithm, and then it spits out a color and a scale that is appropriate for what was in Photoshop. And so this code has also been released on GitHub. It's a Compass gem, but again, it doesn't actually utilize any Compass, so you can use it in a Bourbon project too if you just like strip out, or a vanilla SASS project if you just strip out the source code. Cool. So yeah, so now our button looks perfect. So this is pretty cool. Good button. Great. So we have a button now, and we've been kind of talking about our code, and it's kind of been growing larger and larger the longer that the more that we talk and the more we add to it. And so this is the code now. Like as I've been talking through it, and we've been adding more and more stuff, and it's a lot of code. And so there's a lot of redundancy here. You can see like our background color is defined all over the place, and we're really not taking advantage of a lot of stuff that SASS is good for. So if we turn that code into a mix-in instead of something that we need to copy and paste and change the background colors, we take a mix-in that just takes a background color, and then at the top it can kind of determine whether we're working with a light color or a dark color. It determines our shadow color, and so using a mix-in and making our code modular, we can style an entire button with one line of code, which is pretty awesome. This is great because, so again, in the translation process, not just between designers and developers, but also other developers who are inheriting this project, and you have different levels of developers who may or may not know some like cool, fancy CSS trick. It's a way for us to abstract this code so that the framework, people who are developing this framework, they can enforce a level of abstraction so that junior developers or people, if you're handing this off to a client or whatever, people don't need to know the entire guts of the code. They can just call this button, get a background color, and then our code is just output perfectly. And so now what this means is once we have the system, we can create new buttons, like just that our designer doesn't need to make this complex thing anymore. They're like, okay, we want a new button. It's this color, and we make it. I think this is pretty badass. Yeah, right. So what's the takeaway from this? I mean, this is cool, and this helped me kind of solve my problems with converting, with converting this specific button issue. But really, with SASS, it gives us an opportunity to kind of change the way that we talk to designers. I feel like, there's a total designers are from Venus and developers are from Mars mindset. But so with SASS, it kind of bridges that gap and allows us to kind of speak on the same terms, and so that we don't have to miss any of the design details in the translation process. That's my talk. Thanks, guys. I kind of ripped through that pretty fast, so if you guys have any questions.
So, whoa. Yeah. So I assume that whenever you're building these mix-ins for the junior developers or for maybe a different, maybe a back-end developer to use when laying out or creating the site, you have a lot of utilities too, like maybe parts that aren't like porcelain mix-ins, parts that you as the CSS developer use. How do you organize the code that is like declarative that the junior developers and the people who are constructing things without really knowing the internals of SASS and CSS, how do you separate that from the tools that you've built to help you write those other tools?
That's a good question. I just put it all in a junk drawer, is what I do. No, actually, the article and the talk, Get Rid of Your SASS Junk Drawer, was really influential on me in producing what this actually became a much larger thing, and we created a whole pattern library to hand off to our client based on this. But so this is we have some. Well, these are just Compass mix-ins, so this is a bad example actually. But so we kind of modularize it. We do you end up, as much as you want to clean out your junk drawer, you still end up with a little bit of a junk drawer where it's like with your clear fixes and something to develop, like changing whether a color is light and dark. We've created functions for that. So a lot of this stuff, and like I said, a lot of this stuff gets bundled into extensions, and so we actually have a whole folder for extensions that you can consume extensions as gems, but they can also just live in a folder in your project. And so anything that we end up seeing as something that's reusable and something that might be useful outside of just this particular project, we end up bundling it up as a Compass extension, and ideally putting it on GitHub for other people to use. But so that way it's taken outside of our project code, and so that our project code is just stuff for this particular project, and then anything that's kind of a utility, it gets turned into an extension. So that we can when we start a new project, we just copy that extension folder and put it into the new one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I've kind of it's a button related question, but it's not so much about the Photoshop-y part.
Okay.
I noticed you just have padding, right, for your spacing. This is something that I've been kind of struggling with in my work. How do you control? You have buttons in all kinds of places, right? Yeah. And so maybe some places, if you're using M's for your typography, in some places it's wrapped in a div, and in another place it's in a who knows? What if somebody puts it in an H1 or something terrible?
Sure. Yeah.
How do you make something like this a little more bulletproof when you're going to be using it kind of all over the place?
Well, really, I mean, in an ideal world, you separate your structure from your skin completely. That's sort of a tenet of object-oriented CSS.
Keyword ideal.
Yes, just in this example, you see, I'm adding padding. Well, I guess this is inside the element. But so you're talking about in between elements, spacing between elements, or what?
Well, in the particular issue that I was having at work, it's actually we have buttons, and sometimes they're in headers, and sometimes they're our developers will put them in an H1 just randomly. There's a header on the page, and they'll stick another button. They're just kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
And so with type, occasionally the button gets extra font sizes or like weird things
So
that it like inherits from
the
where.
problem is the cascade.
Right.
How do you deal with the cascade? Well,
I was just curious if that was something that y'all had like run into, or if you had any.
Well, what we do is, what I've been trying to enforce, my company is reducing the amount of the depth of applicability. This is a SMAX tenant. I'm just like, all these different methodologies that I'm pulling from. So you want to limit the depth of applicability so that when you place a style on something, it doesn't. You really want to control the cascade. And so, it's kind of silly to put a button in H1. Let's get real, but in this case, so I guess the example we use here is, so sometimes a link is a button. So we added the important on text decoration. There's a dogma that if you put an important on something, then it means like you're doing it wrong. But every rule is meant to be broken. And so in this case, it would be a lot more work to get around using this important tag, because so every other link on the site uses a text decoration underline, except if the link is a button. And so you get in these weird specificity issues, and it really would cause more code to like not put that important tag on it. And so, if there's something that's like mission critical to like the look of this thing, then I'd say put an important on it if you really want to.
Thanks for the link example. That's happened. I think the H1 is kind of an extreme example, but it's that kind of stuff that I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah, it's kind of a case by case, so really we try to encapsulate things as much as possible. Like this font, we make sure we define that the font size is 100% and that it's trade. We don't let it inherit. We're kind of assuming that we want to take this button, be able to put it anywhere we want. So we shouldn't be assuming that like the font is going to be set as trade Gothic, because that might not be the case. So when you're working in kind of a more modular object-oriented sense, like sometimes like it's like in the short run it feels like it's more code because you're like kind of putting everything that button needs in that placeholder. But in the long run, it's way easier for maintenance, and it makes life easier that way. Cool.
This is possibly more of a philosophical question, but it seems
Cool.
like from your example, and it's very impressive, but that you've gone out to sort of meet the designer on their terms. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I try to do is get the designers to meet the developers on their terms and think about, what's required by the code to get the kind of designs that they're building.
That's kind of selfish, bro.
Yeah, well, but at the end of the day, you might have spent a week putting together what's required to build those buttons, and whereas you could have done something far more simpler, and for the end user, is probably not going to care that you spent 5 days versus.
Oh, this is some navel gazing stuff that I don't.
Yeah, no, and I don't mean it as a criticism at all.
But so I think that what you're getting at is like you want to meet halfway. You don't want to just be the designer's bitch, and and I totally dig that. And so this is the example of that going on, where the designer was coming to me and like the contrast doesn't feel right, and so they didn't have a system for like what color was dark and what color was light. They were just kind of gut feeling it. And so I found this YAQ color contrast. I found this scale, and I came to them and I'm like, hey, I really want to have a system for this, and I don't want to have to like ask you every time we create a new button if it's dark or light. And so this was a compromise. And I don't think probably not every button was the exact color combination that they wanted, but I'm like, does this system work enough that you're happy with it? And so we kind of met halfway with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Should we let you ask a question?
He can do whatever he wants.
I just wanted you to know that we're using YIQ in Compass now for contrast.
What?
We're using the YIQ function for
You are?
contrast in Compass.
Is that new?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Wow.
Awesome. All right. Well, I don't have a talk anymore. That's fine.
Woohoo!
No, that's great. No, that's good. Because now we don't have to tell people to go download an extra extension. It's just, it's better. It's more readable for humans, which is what we're going after. So, great. Anybody else? Besides people who want to make my work irrelevant, please. What? Yeah, right. All right. Well, thanks, guys. It's been great. Yeah.